The SWAT team surrounded my ranch. 12 officers. 3 helicopters. All because Veronica Sterling claimed I was a dangerous squatter. What she didn't know. The document in my safe didn't just prove I owned my ranch. It proved I owned every inch of land her mansion sat on, including her mansion, 6 months before armed officers descended on my property like I was some kind of terrorist. I was just Jasper Blackwood, a 32-year-old software engineer trying to figure out what to do with 300 acres of Montana wilderness. My father had left me. Magnus Blackwood died the way he lived, quietly and without explanation, leaving behind more questions than answers and a ranch I had no idea how to run. The morning I arrived at the property, dust from my rental car still settling on the gravel drive, I found myself staring at weathered fence posts and overgrown pastures, wondering how a man who'd spent his entire career defending Native American land rights had ended up with this much acreage in the first place. My father and I hadn't been close. Distance does that to relationships, both the physical kind and the emotional walls we build when we're too proud to bridge the gap. Esperanza Delgado was waiting on the porch when I pulled up, her silver hair gleaming in the morning sun, weathered hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that had seen better decades. At 72, she moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that rushing through life only meant you missed the important details. The way she looked at me, with a mixture of sympathy and something else I couldn't quite place, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Your father tried to warn them," she said before I'd even introduced myself, her voice carrying the weight of knowledge she wasn't ready to share. But people like Veronica Sterling don't listen to warnings. They only understand consequences. I didn't know who Veronica Sterling was then, but the way Esperanza said her name, like it tasted bitter on her tongue, told me everything I needed to know about their relationship. She handed me a brass keyring with more keys than any reasonable person should need, each one labeled with Magnus's precise handwriting, and pointed to the small lockbox tucked beneath the porch swing. Inside the lockbox, among property deeds and insurance papers, was a USB drive wrapped in plastic with a yellow sticky note attached. My father's handwriting, shakier than I remembered. "Open only when the wolves come." Cryptic even in death. Magnus Blackwood couldn't just leave straightforward instructions like a normal parent. The ranch itself was a contradiction, parts of it meticulously maintained while others showed years of deliberate neglect. The main house stood solid, its log frame construction built to last centuries, but the outbuildings told different stories. Some were locked tight with industrial padlocks, others left open to the elements. It was like my father had been protecting certain areas while abandoning others, creating a puzzle I didn't have the pieces to solve. I'd been there exactly 3 days when Veronica Sterling made her entrance, and what an entrance it was. The sound of her Bentley's engine purring up my gravel drive at 7 a.m. sharp was my first indication that my quiet morning coffee was about to be disrupted. She emerged from the vehicle like she was stepping onto a red carpet, her platinum blonde hair pulled back in a style that probably cost more than most people's car payments, wearing a cream-colored suit that had no business being within 50 miles of a working ranch. Her assistant, a nervous man she called Prescott, scrambled out behind her carrying enough paperwork to reforest a small country. He wore thick-rimmed glasses that kept sliding down his nose as he juggled clipboards, folders, and what appeared to be a professional surveying camera. The way he kept dropping things and picking them up suggested either extreme nervousness or deliberate clumsiness designed to seem harmless. "Mr. Blackwood," Veronica announced, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from never being told no. "I'm Veronica Sterling, president of the Celestial Valley Homeowners Association. We need to discuss the numerous violations your property is currently exhibiting." The way she said currently exhibiting made it sound like my ranch was performing some kind of offensive, interpretive dance. I set down my coffee mug and walked over, noting how her eyes were already scanning my property like a predator cataloging weaknesses. Prescott fumbled with his paperwork, and I caught a glimpse of a folder with Sterling Resort Development emblazoned across the cover before he quickly shuffled it to the bottom of his stack. "Violations?" I asked, extending a hand she ignored in favor of pulling out her phone to begin documenting what she apparently considered criminal negligence. "I've been here 3 days. Haven't even had time to violate any traffic laws, much less whatever regulations you're talking about. She smiled then. The kind of smile that made you understand why ancient cultures believed in demons. Oh, Mr. Blackwood, these violations have been accumulating for years. Your father was resistant to community standards. We hoped his heir might be more reasonable. Prescott cleared his throat and began reading from his clipboard in a monotone that suggested many rehearsals. Violation 1. Unauthorized wildlife habitat in the form of bird feeders exceeding regulated seed capacity. Violation 2. Acoustic pollution from livestock, specifically roosters crowing outside of approved hours. Violation 3. Visual terrorism via the display of deteriorating farm equipment visible from public thoroughfares. Visual terrorism. She actually used those words with a straight face while standing on my property. Uninvited. At 7 in the morning. I caught myself wondering if this was some elaborate prank, but the deadly serious expression on Veronica's face suggested she believed every word of the nonsense her assistant was spouting. There's more, she continued, walking toward the edge of my property where several large rock formations created natural boundary markers, these geological eyesores. For instance, they lower property values for the entire valley. We'll need those removed. The rocks she was photographing weren't just random boulders. Even from a distance, I could see they were arranged too deliberately to be natural, their surfaces carved with symbols worn smooth by centuries of weather. Veronica's interest in them seemed excessive for someone concerned about property values. The way she directed Prescott to photograph them from multiple angles, measuring distances between them with an enthusiasm that didn't match her supposed aesthetic concerns. "Ma'am," I said, trying to keep my voice level despite the absurdity of the situation. "Those rocks have probably been there since before Montana was a state. I'm not removing historical markers because you think they're ugly." Her laugh was like breaking glass. Sharp and designed to cut. "Historical markers, Mr. Blackwood? I think you'll find that in Celestial Valley, the Homeowners Association determines what qualifies as historical, and these obstacles are simply hazardous debris that need to be cleared for public safety." Prescott dropped another folder. And this time I clearly saw architectural blueprints spill out before he frantically gathered them up. The header was partially visible. Phase 1, Mineral Survey Grid. Veronica shot him a look that could have frozen hellfire, and he scurried back to the Bentley to reorganize his materials. "I'm going to need you to leave my property," I said, the coffee in my system finally kicking in enough to process the sheer audacity of these people. "Whatever authority you think you have stops at my property line." Veronica's smile widened, becoming something that belonged in a horror movie. "Oh, Mr. Blackwood, you clearly don't understand how things work in Celestial Valley. 97% of property owners have voluntarily joined our association. The 3% who haven't, well, we have ways of encouraging compliance." She pulled out a thick manila envelope, the kind that made your heart sink before you even opened it. "This is a formal notice of violation under the doctrine of aesthetic necessity. You have 48 hours to remediate these issues or face protective custody proceedings for your property." "Protective custody?" I couldn't help but laugh. "You're going to arrest my ranch?" "In a manner of speaking," she replied, her tone suggesting she'd explained this to other difficult property owners before. "Under Montana state statute." She paused, glancing at Prescott, who quickly supplied Section 7, the 3rd of January 1101, which sounded completely made up. Properties that pose a continuing threat to community wellness can be placed under association management until such time as the owner demonstrates capability for proper stewardship. The sheer brazenness of it was almost admirable. She was standing there, on my land, citing fake laws with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged, but something about the way she kept glancing at those stone markers, the way Prescott had been carrying surveying equipment and mineral survey blueprints, suggested this wasn't really about bird feeders or rooster noise. After they left, their Bentley kicking up dust as it disappeared down the drive, I found myself staring at the USB drive my father had left. "Open only when the wolves come." Looking at the folder Prescott had dropped, at the business card Veronica had handed me, with her direct number and a website for Sterling Resort Development barely hidden on the back. I had a feeling the wolves weren't just coming. They were already here. That evening, Esperanza appeared at my door like she'd been waiting for Veronica's visit to happen. She carried a basket of what she called "welcome to the neighborhood" baked goods. But her eyes held the weight of someone delivering more than muffins. We sat on the porch as the sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, and she began to tell me things about my father I'd never known. Magnus spent 40 years fighting for native land rights, she said, her voice soft but steady. He wasn't just some lawyer. He was a guardian of secrets that powerful people would kill to possess. Those stones Veronica was so interested in? They're surveyor markers. Yes, but not the kind she thinks. I leaned forward, the USB drive burning a hole in my pocket where I'd been carrying it like a talisman. What kind are they? Esperanza's smile was sad and knowing. The kind that mark boundaries established before Montana was even a territory? The kind that were placed by your ancestors when they signed treaties with the federal government. Your father knew their true significance, and he knew that someday, someone like Veronica would come sniffing around when they got wind of what's really under this land. What's under the land, I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. More than gold? More than oil, she said cryptically. Something the modern world desperately needs and desperately wants to control. Your father spent the last 20 years of his life making sure the legal protections were ironclad, but he always said the real protection would come from his son, understanding the truth. She stood to leave, pressing a piece of paper into my hand. When you're ready to open that USB drive, remember that your father loved riddles. The password isn't just in the surveyor stones, it's in what they mark. That night, I sat at my father's desk, laptop open, USB drive inserted, staring at a password prompt that might as well have been asking for the meaning of life. I tried everything I could think of: birthdays, anniversaries, the names of cases he'd won, even the coordinates of the ranch itself. Nothing worked. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, their calls echoing across the valley like warnings or promises. I walked out to where the surveyor stones stood, their surfaces catching moonlight in ways that made the worn symbols almost readable. Running my hands over them, I found numbers carved so faintly they were almost invisible, coordinates, but not in any modern format. Back at the computer, I converted the old surveying coordinates to modern GPS format and typed them in. The screen flickered, and suddenly I was looking at documents that made my blood run cold and my heart race simultaneously. Aboriginal Land Treaty of 1842. Congressional Land Grant Override of 1876. Federal Mining Rights Exclusion of 1923. And at the bottom, a deed that encompassed not just my ranch but the entire valley. Signed by my great-great-great-grandfather, Chief Joseph Blackwood, and President Ulysses S. Grant himself. The implications were staggering. Every piece of property in Celestial Valley, all 15,000 acres of it, sat on land that had never been legally sold or transferred from my family's ownership, including Veronica Sterling's mansion, including the country club, including the sites marked on those mineral survey maps Prescott had dropped. My phone rang at 5 a.m. the next morning. Dmitry Volkov's voice, thick with a Russian accent that sounded like it had been marinated in expensive vodka and cheap threats, informed me that he was Veronica's attorney and that I had 24 hours remaining to comply with the remediation order. Mr. Blackwood, he said, each word carefully pronounced like he was savoring the intimidation. My client is prepared to be generous. She could simply proceed with protective custody proceedings, but she would prefer a cooperative solution. Perhaps we could discuss a conservation easement that would protect your rustic lifestyle while ensuring community standards are maintained. And this conservation easement, I said, already knowing the answer. Would it happen to include mineral rights? The pause on the other end of the line told me everything. When Dmitry spoke again, his voice had lost some of its smoothness. All standard provisions would be included to ensure the land is properly protected from exploitation. By exploitation, you mean me actually owning what's mine? Ownership is such a complex concept, Dmitry replied, and I could practically hear him shrugging through the phone. Once we acquire the mineral rights, he caught himself. But not quickly enough. That is, Once the community's interests are properly protected, everyone benefits. I hung up and immediately called the number on the business card Esperanza had given me for Zara Kim. An investigative journalist she'd said might be interested in a story about HOA overreach. What I hadn't expected was for Zara to answer on the second ring, sounding like she'd been awake for hours. "Jasper Blackwood," she said before I could even introduce myself. "Esperanza told me you might be calling. I've been investigating Veronica Sterling for 6 months. Did you know she's filed for mineral development permits on land she doesn't own in 3 different states? She's about to make it 4. I said, filling her in on the morning's conversation with Dimitri. "How sure are you about your ownership documents?" Zara asked. And I could hear her typing rapidly in the background. "Sure enough that I think Veronica's about to do something desperate to get me off this land before anyone finds out the truth." Zara's laugh was sharp and excited, the sound of a journalist smelling blood in the water. "Oh, she's going to do something desperate, all right. My sources tell me she's planning something for tomorrow. Something public. Something designed to make you look dangerous enough that no one will question whatever happens next." I spent the rest of that day preparing for war in the way my father had taught me, with documentation. I made copies of everything, sent sealed packets to 3 different lawyers, uploaded encrypted files to secure servers, and created a paper trail that would survive whatever Veronica had planned. The original documents went into my father's safe, a massive thing that had supposedly survived a fire that destroyed the original ranch house in 1952. That evening, Esperanza returned with more than baked goods. She brought 2 banker's boxes full of letters, photographs, and newspaper clippings dating back to the 1920s. "Your father asked me to hold on to these," she said, setting them on the kitchen table with the reverence of someone handling religious artifacts. "He said when the time came, you'd need to understand the full history of what you're protecting." The documents told a story of greed, deception, and resistance spanning 4 generations. Mining companies that had tried to steal the land through legal trickery, development corporations that had attempted to invalidate the original treaty, local politicians who'd been bought and sold, trying to use eminent domain for projects that never materialized. And through it all, the Blackwood family had held the line, keeping the secret of what lay beneath the valley while fighting off every attempt to steal it. "What exactly is down there?" I asked, holding a geological survey from 1987 that had more redacted sections than visible text. Esperanza shook her head. "Your father never told me exactly. He said knowing too much made you a target. But he did say it was worth more than all the gold ever pulled out of Montana, and that in the wrong hands, it could destroy everything the treaty was meant to protect." As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. A video file. I opened it to see Veronica Sterling standing in what looked like her home office, speaking earnestly to the camera. "My fellow Celestial Valley residents," she began, "I come to you tonight with deeply disturbing news about a dangerous individual who has recently taken possession of the old Blackwood Ranch." The video was professionally edited, with ominous music and carefully selected photos that made my property look like a post-apocalyptic wasteland. She spoke about aggressive behavior I'd never exhibited, threats I'd never made, and weapons I didn't own. The production value was impressive for something that was completely fabricated. "She's going live with this tomorrow." Zara's text came through seconds later. "My source says she's planning to stream it on every platform while something happens at your ranch. Something that will require law enforcement intervention." I looked at the boxes of history Esperanza had brought, at the USB drive with its world-changing documents, at the photos of my father standing proudly beside the surveyor stones that marked the true boundaries of our land. The wolves weren't just coming anymore. They were at the door, and tomorrow they planned to huff and puff and blow my house down. "Let them come," I said to the empty room, my father's spirit seeming to approve from whatever ancestral hunting ground he now occupied. "The Blackwoods have been fighting this fight for over a century. I'm not about to be the one who loses it." Outside, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, promising rain by morning. Nature itself seemed to be choosing sides, and I spent the rest of the night preparing for a battle that would determine not just my future, but the future of 15,000 acres of land that held secrets worth killing for. The sound of helicopters at dawn isn't something you forget. 3 of them, circling my ranch like mechanical vultures, while the sun painted the mountains blood red. I stood on my porch, coffee mug in one hand, phone recording in the other, watching Veronica Sterling's master plan unfold with the precision of a Swiss watch and the subtlety of a sledgehammer. She'd started her live stream at exactly 6 a.m., broadcasting from what appeared to be a makeshift command center in the Celestial Valley Community Center. Behind her, a wall of monitors showed various angles of my property, including footage that could only have been taken by someone trespassing in the dead of night. The production value suggested she'd spent serious money on this character assassination for too long. We've allowed dangerous individuals to threaten our community's safety, Veronica announced to her audience, her face arranged in an expression of grave concern that would have been convincing if you didn't know she was lying through her professionally whitened teeth. Today, with the help of law enforcement, we're taking action to protect our families from the armed and dangerous squatter who has illegally occupied the Blackwood Ranch. Armed and dangerous. Squatter. Every word carefully chosen to justify what was coming. I texted Zara to make sure she was getting all of this, and her response was a thumbs-up emoji followed by coordinates. She was already in position with her drone equipment, ready to document whatever was about to happen from angles Veronica hadn't anticipated. The first police car arrived at 6:23, followed by another, then another, until my driveway looked like a law enforcement convention. Officers emerged with weapons drawn, treating me like I was some kind of domestic terrorist instead of a software engineer who'd inherited a ranch. The lead officer, Captain Rex Morrison, according to his badge, approached with the measured steps of someone who'd done this too many times to count. "Jasper Blackwood," he called out, his hand resting on his service weapon, "we need you to step out with your hands visible. We've received reports of threats and illegal weapons on this property." I set down my coffee mug slowly, keeping my phone recording, and raised my hands. "Captain Morrison, I'm coming out, but I want you to know that every single report you've received is fabricated. I have documentation that will prove not only my ownership of this property, but also the criminal conspiracy behind today's events." Morrison's expression flickered with something that might have been doubt, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "Sir, we'll sort all that out, but right now, I need you to comply with our instructions for everyone's safety." I reached into my jacket pocket, moving deliberately slowly. I'm reaching for a document. "Captain, one piece of paper that's going to change everything about this situation." Several officers tensed, but Morrison held up a hand to keep them steady. I pulled out the laminated copy of the federal land patent, holding it where he could see the official seals and signatures. His eyes widened slightly as he recognized what he was looking at. "Captain," I said, loud enough for the other officers to hear, "that document is a federal land patent from 1876, signed by President Grant himself. It grants my family ownership of 15,000 acres of Celestial Valley, including the land under every building, every road, and every house in this community, including the mansion belonging to Veronica Sterling, who's currently live-streaming false accusations about me." Morrison stepped closer, his body language shifting from aggressive to cautious. He studied the document, his expression growing more troubled with each line he read. This can't be real. It's real, and I have the complete chain of documentation to prove it," I said, gesturing toward the house. "There's a safe inside with originals dating back to an 1842 treaty between my ancestors and the federal government. What Veronica Sterling hasn't told you is that she's attempting to steal mineral rights worth approximately $50 million in rare earth elements that lie beneath this valley." Behind Morrison, I could see Prescott trying to look inconspicuous as he edged toward my barn with a duffel bag, exactly where Zara had predicted he'd go based on the camera angles from Veronica's stream. I didn't react, trusting that Zara's drone was capturing every moment of whatever evidence he was about to plant. "That's an interesting claim, Mr. Blackwood," Morrison said carefully, "but we still need to search the property based on the complaints we've received. Then I invoke my Fourth Amendment rights and demand to see a warrant," I replied, knowing they didn't have one because Veronica had been counting on me either fleeing or resisting arrest to justify a warrantless search. Morrison's jaw tightened. He was caught between his duty and his growing realization that something wasn't right about this entire operation, that's when Dmitry Volkov chose to make his appearance, stepping out of a black town car, like a movie villain arriving for the final act. "Captain Morrison," Dmitry called out in his vodka, smooth voice. "My client has video evidence of Mr. Blackwood making terroristic threats. Surely that provides probable cause for an immediate search to ensure public safety." "What video evidence?" I asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The creatively edited footage your client compiled from illegally obtained surveillance? Or the threats I supposedly made that mysteriously have no witnesses despite allegedly happening in public?" Dmitry's confident smile faltered slightly. He hadn't expected me to be this prepared, this calm. In his experience, people surrounded by armed officers usually panicked, made mistakes, gave him something to exploit. But I'd spent the night studying my father's notes on dealing with legal intimidation, and panic wasn't on the agenda. "Captain Morrison," I continued, "I'm willing to cooperate fully, but I need you to understand what's really happening here. Veronica Sterling has been running a fraudulent HOA, collecting fees and fines based on authority she doesn't possess. She sold development rights to land she doesn't own to at least 3 outside investors. And now she's orchestrating this elaborate theater to remove me from my property before her victims discover the truth." Morrison looked between me, Dmitry, and the officers surrounding my property. The helicopters continued their circular patrol, their presence seeming increasingly excessive for a simple property dispute. Then his radio crackled to life. "Captain, we've got a situation," the voice reported. "Someone just uploaded a video showing an individual planting what appears to be weapons in the suspect's barn. The video's going viral, and the individual in the footage matches the description of someone at your location." Morrison's head snapped toward the barn where Prescott was just emerging, trying to brush hay off his expensive suit. The duffel bag was nowhere to be seen, but his guilty expression told the entire story. Morrison gestured to 2 officers who moved to intercept Prescott before he could return to Veronica's mobile command center. "Mr. Blackwood," Morrison said, his tone shifting from confrontational to investigative, "I think we need to have a more detailed conversation about what's really going on here." That's when Veronica made her critical mistake, watching her carefully orchestrated plan fall apart on her own live stream. She abandoned her fake concern and let her real personality shine through. Her voice, carried by speakers she'd set up to ensure everyone could hear her broadcasts, rang out across the property. "Captain Morrison, you're making a grave error," she announced, her tone switching from concerned citizen to imperious commander. "I have the authority to reclaim this property under the doctrine of aesthetic necessity. If you won't remove this criminal, I'll exercise my emergency powers as HOA president to protect our community myself." Even from 50 yards away, I could see Morrison's expression shift from confused to deeply skeptical. "Ma'am, what emergency powers are you referring to exactly?" Veronica's response, broadcast to thousands of viewers watching her stream, would later be played in courtrooms as evidence of her delusions of grandeur. "The same powers that allow me to collect fees, impose fines, and maintain standards throughout this valley. The same powers that will allow Sterling Resort Development to transform this wasteland into a profitable extraction operation for the rare earth elements beneath our feet." The silence that followed her admission was deafening. Even the helicopters seemed to pause in their orbits. She'd just confessed to the entire scheme on her own live stream, so caught up in her fury at losing control that she'd forgotten she was still broadcasting. "Did she just admit to fraud on a live stream?" one of the younger officers whispered, loud enough for his body cam to pick up. Zara's drone footage, which she was streaming on her own channel, captured the exact moment Veronica realized what she'd done. The color drained from her face as Prescott, now in custody, began babbling about how none of this was his idea and he'd just been following orders and he had emails that proved everything. Morrison turned back to me with an expression that suggested he'd like to be anywhere else but was too professional to abandon his duty. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm going to need to see all of that documentation you mentioned. And ma'am," he called out to Veronica, "I'm going to need you to stop broadcasting and come speak with us." But Veronica Sterling hadn't built her empire of fake authority by giving up easily. She stormed toward us, her camera operator struggling to keep up, designer heels clicking on asphalt with the rapid-fire tempo of barely controlled rage. "This is my valley," she declared, apparently forgetting or not caring that she was still being recorded. "I've spent 3 years building the infrastructure to extract those minerals. 3 years of planning, investing, bribing the right people." She caught herself again. But the damage was done. "Ma'am," Morrison said carefully, "I'm going to need you to stop talking and contact your attorney." "I am in contact with my attorney," she spat, gesturing at Dmitri, who was slowly backing toward his town car with the expression of a lawyer watching his career implode in real time. "Tell them, Dmitri, tell them about our legal authority." Dmitri cleared his throat, his accent suddenly thicker as he fell back on old habits from what I suspected was a less-than-legal past. "Veronica, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "Tell them!" she screamed, completely losing the composed facade she'd maintained for 3 years. "Tell them about the mineral surveys, about the investors from Beijing, about the processing facility plans." Each word was another nail in her legal coffin. And Morrison was professional enough to let her keep talking while making sure everything was being recorded. I pulled out my phone and texted my newly hired attorney, a friend of my father's named Patricia Crowfeather, who specialized in treaty law, letting her know the situation was resolving itself in the most dramatic way possible. "Mr. Blackwood," Morrison said quietly while Veronica continued her self-incriminating rant, "I'm starting to understand why your father kept such detailed records. Would you be willing to show us the original documents you mentioned?" I nodded, leading Morrison and 2 other officers into the house, while the rest maintained a perimeter around the increasingly chaotic scene outside. The safe opened with a combination my father had hidden in a letter only I would understand, revealing stacks of documents that told the true history of Celestial Valley. Morrison whistled low as he examined treaty papers signed by chiefs and presidents, congressional orders that superseded state law, and geological surveys that confirmed the presence of rare earth elements in concentrations that would make any mining company salivate. But the document that made him shake his head in amazement was the comprehensive lease registry from 1924. "Every property in the valley is listed here," he said, running his finger down entries written in fountain pen, "including the Sterling family estate. They've been paying lease fees to your family for 100 years? Until 1987. I corrected, showing him the last entry. "That's when Reginald Sterling, Veronica's grandfather, stopped paying and started claiming the family owned the land outright. My father was preparing to take legal action when he got sick." Morrison looked at me with new understanding. "And Veronica knew all of this?" "The investors from Beijing certainly didn't," I said. "I'm guessing she promised them clear title to mineral-rich land she had no right to sell." Outside, the situation was reaching its crescendo. Zara had landed her drone and was conducting impromptu interviews with officers who seemed eager to distance themselves from what was clearly becoming a massive fraud investigation. Prescott, still in custody, had progressed from babbling to openly weeping while begging someone, anyone, to believe that he was just a personal assistant who'd gotten in over his head. Veronica had finally stopped talking, possibly because Dmitri had physically placed his hand over her mouth, a move that would have been assault under any other circumstances but which Morrison pretended not to notice. The helicopters, their pilots presumably wondering why they'd been hired for such an anticlimactic operation, were beginning to peel away one by one. "Mr. Blackwood," Morrison said formally, "I apologize for the disruption to your morning. It's clear that we were provided with false information designed to weaponize law enforcement for private gain. I'll need you to file a complete statement. But as far as I'm concerned, you're free to go about your day." "What about them?" I asked, nodding toward Veronica and Dmitri. Morrison's smile was grim but satisfied. "Oh, they'll be coming with us. Miss, Sterling has some questions to answer about filing false police reports. Fraud, conspiracy. And based on what she just admitted on livestream, possibly international wire fraud if those Beijing investors transferred any money. The arrest itself was almost anticlimactic after the morning's drama. Veronica Sterling, who'd terrorized an entire community with her fake authority and elaborate schemes, was reduced to a middle-aged woman in handcuffs being read her rights, while thousands watched online. Dmitry tried to negotiate some kind of deal on the spot, offering to testify against his client in exchange for immunity, which told you everything about their professional relationship. Prescott, eager to minimize his own culpability, produced a laptop containing what he called insurance, emails, documents, and recorded conversations that painted a comprehensive picture of Veronica's 3-year campaign to defraud an entire community. The FBI would later call it one of the most extensively documented cases of real estate fraud they'd ever seen, largely because Veronica had been meticulous about recording her own crimes. As the police cars pulled away, taking with them the woman who'd tried to steal a legacy my family had protected for over a century, I found myself standing beside those ancient surveyor stones. Esperanza appeared beside me, moving with her usual quiet grace, carrying a leather journal I recognized as my father's. "He would have been proud," she said simply, handing me the journal. "You fought with law instead of violence, with truth instead of deception. That's the Blackwood way." I opened the journal to find my father's handwriting, still strong despite his illness. "Son," the first entry read, "if you're reading this, then the wolves finally came. What follows is the complete history of our family's guardianship of this land, and instructions for what comes next. The minerals beneath our feet are valuable, yes, but they're also dangerous if extracted carelessly. Our ancestors knew this, which is why the treaty includes provisions not just for ownership but for protection." The rest of the day passed in a blur of statements, interviews, and phone calls from lawyers representing the other families who'd been paying illegal HOA fees to Veronica's fictitious organization. Patricia Crowfeather arrived by afternoon, bringing with her a team of paralegals and the kind of quiet confidence that came from never losing a treaty law case. "The Beijing investors are already claiming they were defrauded," she told me over coffee in my kitchen, the same table where Esperanza had spread out the historical documents the night before. "They're cooperating fully with authorities and have agreed to testify against Sterling and Volkov. The Canadian company that bought development rights to the northern section is doing the same. Apparently, Veronica sold the same rights to 3 different groups. What happens to everyone else?" I asked. Thinking of the 500 families who'd built homes and lives on land they thought they owned. Patricia smiled, and I understood why my father had trusted her. "That's up to you. The law is clear. The land belongs to the Blackwood Trust. But the law also allows for you to formalize the lease arrangements your family informally allowed to lapse. We can create a community land trust, charge nominal fees, and ensure no one loses their homes while preventing future Veronicas from exploiting the situation." Over the following weeks, as Veronica's empire of lies unraveled thread by thread, revealing the full scope of her attempted theft, I worked with Patricia and a committee of community members to create something unprecedented, the Celestial Valley Community Land Trust, with transparent governance and bylaws that prevented any individual from accumulating the kind of power Veronica had claimed. The trust meetings were nothing like Veronica's HOA gatherings. Instead of her lecturing terrified homeowners about grass height, we had genuine discussions about land use, conservation, and how to protect the mineral wealth beneath our feet from exploitation while ensuring the community thrived. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Veronica's attempted theft had actually resulted in stronger protections for the land than had existed before. Dmitry Volkov, true to his nature, flipped on Veronica so fast he practically got whiplash. His testimony revealed the international scope of her fraud. She'd been in negotiations with mining companies from 6 different countries, each believing they had exclusive rights to extract minerals from land she didn't own. The FBI calculated she'd collected over $12 million in deposits for rights she couldn't deliver. The most surprising revelation came from Veronica's daughter, Astrid, who reached out through Patricia to arrange a meeting. At 16, she'd watched her mother transform from a bitter divorcee into a criminal mastermind, and she wanted to apologize for her family's actions. She wasn't always like this. Astrid told me over coffee at the same diner where Esperanza had first warned me about the wolves. After the divorce, when Dad got custody because of her control issues, something broke inside her. The HOA gave her a sense of power again, but it was never enough. She always needed more, I thought about my own father, about the choices we make and the legacies we leave. What will you do now? Astrid smiled sadly. Esperanza offered me a job helping with the historical preservation project. I want to learn the real history of this valley, not the fiction my mother created. Maybe understanding the past will help me build a better future. The trials, when they came, were almost anticlimactic. Veronica's own livestream confession, combined with Prescott's evidence cache and Dimitri's eager testimony, made conviction a foregone conclusion. She received 15 years for fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. Though she'd be eligible for parole in 7 with good behavior, Dimitri got 5 years but would likely serve 2. His cooperation, buying him leniency he probably didn't deserve. The Beijing investors, surprisingly, asked if they could still lease mineral rights through proper channels. After extensive consultation with environmental experts and tribal advisors, we agreed to a limited extraction plan that would fund community projects while protecting the land's ecological integrity. The rare earth elements, it turned out, could be extracted using innovative techniques that minimized environmental impact, providing a model for responsible resource development. 6 months after SWAT helicopters had circled my ranch, I stood again beside the surveyor stones, this time surrounded by community members who'd gathered for the dedication of the Celestial Valley Historical Preserve. The stones, once threatened with removal as geological eyesores, were now protected monuments. Their true significance finally acknowledged. Zara Kim was there, filming for her documentary that had already won 3 awards and sparked a national conversation about HOA abuse and property rights. Her footage of that morning's events had been viewed over 10 million times, turning her from a local journalist into a nationally recognized investigative reporter. "How does it feel?" she asked. Camera rolling, as always. I thought about my father, about the generations of Blackwoods who'd protected this land, about Veronica Sterling, in her federal prison cell probably still believing she was the victim. "It feels like justice," I said finally. "Not revenge. Not victory. Just justice." The ceremony concluded with Esperanza reading from the original treaty, her voice carrying across the valley as she spoke words written in 1842 about protection, preservation, and the sacred duty of guardianship. When she finished, the crowd dispersed slowly, neighbors talking with neighbors, children playing among the monuments their parents had once been told to fear. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I opened my father's journal to the last entry. "The land doesn't belong to us," he'd written. "We belong to the land. Our job is to protect it from those who would exploit it, to preserve it for those who will come after. The wolves will always come, in different forms, with different lies, but the truth, carved in stone and written in law, will always prevail." The ranch was quiet now, the drama of the past months fading into memory and legal precedent, but I kept the USB drive, updated with new documentation, new protections, new safeguards against future wolves. Because my father was right, they would come again, in different forms, with different schemes, but the Blackwoods would be ready. We always were. 1 year later, I received an unexpected letter forwarded through Patricia's office. The return address was the Federal Correctional Institution where Veronica Sterling was serving her sentence. My first instinct was to throw it away, unopened, but curiosity won out. Her handwriting was smaller than I'd expected, cramped and careful, nothing like the bold signatures she'd used to terrorize a community. "Mr. Blackwood," it began, "I've had considerable time to reflect on my actions and the harm I caused. This is not an apology. I know words cannot undo what I've done. Rather, this is a warning." I sat down at my father's desk, the same place where I'd first opened the USB drive that changed everything, and continued reading. My investors weren't just from Beijing. There are others, people I never met directly, who have interests in rare earth elements that go beyond simple profit. They knew about your family's land before I did. Someone fed me information, guided me toward Celestial Valley, and I was too blinded by my own greed to question why. The letter went on to describe encrypted communications, untraceable payments, and instructions that had seemed like business advice, but now, with the clarity of hindsight and imprisonment, looked more like manipulation. "I was a fool," she wrote, "but I wasn't the first and I won't be the last. They're patient. These people, they've been trying to access those minerals for decades. Your father knew. Check his files for something called Project Tungsten." I found myself believing her. Not because I trusted Veronica Sterling, but because the details she provided matched too closely with gaps in my father's records. That evening, I went through his files again, this time looking specifically for references to Project Tungsten. What I found made my blood run cold. Project Tungsten was a Defense Department initiative from the 1980s and classification levels that should have made the documents impossible for a civilian lawyer to possess. But Magnus Blackwood had never been just a civilian lawyer. The papers revealed that the rare earth elements under Celestial Valley weren't just valuable, they were strategically critical, containing specific isotopes that didn't exist anywhere else, in quantities sufficient for certain classified applications. The real protection for the land wasn't the treaty or the land patent. It was the federal government's own interest in keeping these minerals out of foreign hands while maintaining plausible deniability about their importance. My father had played a decades-long chess game, using legal ownership to protect resources that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. I shared the information with Patricia, who wasn't surprised. "Your father consulted with me about this years ago," she admitted. "He wanted to ensure that the land trust structure we discussed would prevent any future sale to foreign entities, even if you or your descendants wanted to. It's ironclad. The minerals can only be accessed by U.S. companies with proper security clearances and only with community approval." The implications were staggering. Veronica Sterling, in her greed and delusion, had stumbled into a national security issue without realizing it. Her arrest hadn't just stopped a real estate fraud, it had prevented a potential transfer of critical resources to foreign powers who'd been patiently maneuvering for decades. 3 days after reading Veronica's letter, I had visitors, not the FBI this time, but representatives from agencies that didn't officially exist, carrying credentials that would vanish the moment they left my property. They thanked me for my patriotic service and assured me that the situation was now properly monitored. They also made it clear that the Community Land Trust was the perfect solution. It protected the resources while maintaining the cover story of a simple property dispute resolved through legal channels. The Celestial Valley Community Land Trust would receive certain federal grants, they explained, to ensure its continued operation and the prosperity of its residents. In exchange, we would continue to be good stewards of land that was more important than most people would ever know. As they left, one of them turned back. "Your father was a remarkable man, Mr. Blackwood. He understood that sometimes the best way to protect something is to make it appear not worth taking. The real treasure isn't the minerals, it's the community that guards them without even knowing it." Standing once again by the surveyor stones as the sun set over the valley, I understood finally why my father had been so cryptic in his instructions. The truth wasn't just about land ownership or mineral rights. It was about guardianship of something that transcended property lines and legal documents. The Blackwood legacy wasn't wealth or power. It was the duty to stand between exploitation and preservation, to be the shepherd that keeps the wolves at bay. Esperanza joined me, as she often did during these evening contemplations. "He would be proud," she said simply. "You've not only protected the land but given it a future." In the distance, lights were coming on in 500 homes throughout the valley. Families living their lives in peace, unaware of the battles fought and won on their behalf. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. Not the arrest of Veronica Sterling or the exposure of her schemes, but the simple fact that tonight, children would sleep safely in their beds while beneath their feet. Secrets worth killing for remained protected by law. Community. And the enduring legacy of those who came before. The wolves would come again. They always did. But the Blackwood family would be here, watching from beside the ancient stones, guardians of a trust that ran deeper than blood and stronger than greed. And that was enough.